Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Dean Shankman, for inviting me. You guys have been great hosts. I really appreciate everyone coming out here. This is my first time in Kansas ever. I should say my first time intentionally in Kansas. 20 years ago, I was in Kansas City, Missouri, took a wrong turn, crossed a street called State Line Road, quickly turned around and left. So today I set foot, I ate ribs, so I feel like I'm really in Kansas. So I wrote Alienated America. I loved writing it. I think it's an important book, and I wrote it because I had a story that I came across, a story to tell, and it's about, I use some sort of corny phrases at times, the American dream. This is a book about the American dream and the widely held view that the American dream is dead. So it's a book about work, it's a book about faith, it's a book about family and community. And to some extent, because the story I'm going to tell is about how I came across it, it's a book about how Donald Trump became the president of the United States. Because I'm a political reporter, the story starts one state away in Iowa. And because I am an Irish Catholic, this story begins naturally in a bar. A sports bar called Joe's Place in Iowa City. A few weeks before the 2016 caucuses, I was taking in an Iowa versus Michigan State game. I met a couple that lived in Iowa City. The wife worked at the university, but told me that she had grown up in Orange City in northwest Iowa. As I said, I'm an Irish Catholic, so the color orange, if you know Irish history, can be a bit triggering. So I said, what does the orange stand for there? And she said, oh, well, we're Dutch. And I said, I'm from the East Coast. Pennsylvania Dutch? She was like, no, we're Dutch. I said, how Dutch are you? Because I'm from New York. You know, you're Irish, you're Italian, you have real ethnicity. Do you guys really have real Dutch ethnicity there? And this woman, whose name was Holly Vander something, says, let me put it this way. I used to wear wooden clogs marching past Windmill Square for the Tulip Festival. And she wasn't talking about the mother country. This was in Iowa. And as it went on, it sounded like it was a Simpsons episode making fun of Dutch people in the Midwest. I didn't know this existed. So I got in my car and I went out to Sioux County, Iowa, where Orange City is. It is the Dutchest county in America. I visited Orange City as well as Sioux Center. In Sioux Center, I attended a Jeb Bush rally a few weeks before the caucuses at a Christian college called Dordt College. And the Dutchness was, yes, overwhelming. The first woman I met told me her name was Wilhelmina and bragged that she was named after the Queen of the Netherlands for both World Wars. The other thing that was also overwhelming was a complete disinterest in Donald Trump. Now, again, this is not Trump versus Hillary. This was a very conservative town. In the general election, almost all of these people would vote for Donald Trump. But when there were 16 men on stage, 16 men and women running for the Republican nomination, almost nobody in Sioux County was interested in Trump. One pastor told me that of his 900 congregants, he knew of only one who was backing Trump in the caucuses. One questioner, when asking about Trump, refused to even say his name, just called him a candidate with the initials DT. So, sure enough, the caucuses come and go. Trump bombed in Sioux County. He got 11%. It was his worst county in the state. In the caucuses, he got 27% statewide, a higher portion in the rural counties. In this one rural conservative county, he got only 11%. And so his other worst counties, the 5 worst counties, included Lyon County next door, which is the second most Dutch county there, and Marion, which is where Pella is, the single biggest Dutch city in Iowa. So we political analysts, we talk about a Hispanic vote, a black vote, a Catholic vote. Nobody ever talked about a Dutch vote before. But this was a real thing, it seemed. Conservative Republicans resisting Donald Trump in the caucuses. So why was this? I asked Ted Cruz at one point on the trail, I said, you're winning these Dutch places, what's going on? And he said, well, Tim, you know, the Dutch people, they're really nice. They want a nice guy. Donald's not nice. They're going to vote for a nice guy. And I was thinking, like Ted Cruz? And so that didn't fly. Somebody else told me, I think they're upset at Trump for appropriating the color orange. Also, that one didn't convince me. But I look out, so Michigan's coming up. I look out at Western Michigan, of course, Holland, Michigan. Sure enough, if you look at the Michigan electoral map, Trump dominates the whole state, but he bombs in those 4 Dutch counties out west. And so what was going on? A better explanation than the one that Cruz gave me. So then I spoken to this one guy at Dordt College. He was a political liberal. He was a husband of one of the professors out there. And he said, well, out here, people vote right, but they live left. And for a second, I didn't know what he was talking about. I was thinking, do I have like a really big story here? What have I discovered in the middle of the Great Plains? This is a bunch of like swingers and pot smokers. And I said, what do you mean? He said, no. His exact quote, that's just what you do. You care about your neighbors, you care about your environment, and you take care of it yourself. Now, I'm a conservative guy, so the idea that that was living left I found really obnoxious, but I knew what he meant, and it was a really important thing. The sense of social trust and duty to one's neighbor was very high in Holland, Michigan, and in Sioux County. And so the New Yorker ran a profile on Orange City a couple years later. Channeling the arguments of the townspeople, the article read, there are plenty of jobs here. It'll take you 5 minutes to drive to work. When you have children, we'll help you take care of them. People here share your values. It's a good Christian place, and they care about you. If anything happens, they'll have your back. So it was starting to become clear to me what was going on. The candidate who had declared the American dream is dead was bombing in the places where the American dream was most alive. And so, just quickly, my book does have a lot of numbers, and if you read the Amazon reviews, one of them says this was really good, but there's too much data for me. But I promise you, it's not all numbers. There's lots of stories. In fact, my mom's one edit was take out half the numbers. So there's half as many numbers as there originally was. But so the places where the American dream was alive was where Trump was bombing. If you look at here's one bit of numbers crunched by the New York Times. In places where jobs were more vulnerable to outsourcing or competition, Trump did better. Where fewer men had college degrees, Trump did better. Trump significantly outperformed Romney in counties where residents had lower credit scores and in counties where more men have stopped working. More subprime loans, more Trump support. More residents receiving disability payments, more Trump support. Lower earnings among full-time workers, more Trump support. Again, a reminder, this is not Trump versus Hillary, Republican versus Democrat. This is the people who had never participated in politics before. The people I'd find outside the Trump rallies in places all over the country had never voted, and now they were waiting 4 hours to watch a politician speak. They were people, they were not the people who were in these robust, thriving, really cohesive communities. They were the people in these other types of places. So Wisconsin was coming up, and I had to figure this Dutch puzzle out. So I went to a village called Oostburg of 2,000 people. It's about 50% Dutch, and because I got there on Sunday morning and planted myself at the diner, what should have been obvious to me earlier about these places came very obvious. The families came pouring in from the 9 a.m. services at the First Reformed Church and the 9 a.m. services at Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian. Then the families came pouring in from the 9:15 at First Presbyterian Church, and the diner was starting to really get full when the families came in from the 9:30 services at the First Christian Reformed Church. Do not confuse the First Reformed Church with the First Christian Reformed Church. That's a feud that goes way back. In this village of 2,000, there were 4 Reformed churches, 4 churches in this same Calvinist Reformed tradition, a village of 2,000. Throughout the day, I learned that many of these people would go back at 6 p.m. for a second Sunday service or Bible study. So the thing that made these Dutch communities so strong and so cohesive were the churches and the Christian schools and the other church-related institutions that spun out of the churches. So these Reformed churches had planted themselves in towns, in places all across the Midwest. And they had planted not just a church, but a real community. They had built hardy, robust, tightly knit communities that have ended up warding off the maladies that hit so much of rural America today. The inequality, the retreat from marriage, the out-of-wedlock births, the opioids, and the deaths of despair that can characterize so much of rural America were fought off by these really dense communities built around these churches. And it wasn't just the Dutch, of course. Donald Trump's second worst state in the primaries was Utah. His worst counties were all Mormon counties in Utah and Idaho. And I saw it closer to home. While Trump won most of Silver Spring, which is a middle-class part of Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, he lost badly in 2 precincts right around Arcola Avenue and Kemp Mill Road. If you're from the D.C. area, you might be familiar with those names, because on each of those roads is an Orthodox synagogue. And the people who attend there, none of them drive. There's a prohibition on driving on the Sabbath. So everybody has to live within walking distance of the synagogue on Arcola or the synagogue on Kemp Mill. So the precincts right around those 2 roads voted overwhelmingly for Ted Cruz in the Republican primary, because the strong religious communities, particularly ones that were obligated to live within walking distance, was another place where, while very different from Salt Lake City or Oostburg, the American dream was alive. So it's interesting, by the way, being a Catholic with 6 kids living in that neighborhood. You walk into a grocery store with your 6 kids and they point you straight to the kosher food aisle. Go down the road a little to the tonier parts of Montgomery County, walking with your 6 kids, and they point you to the family planning aisle. But speaking of the tonier parts, some of you may have heard of a place also in Montgomery County, Maryland, called Chevy Chase, because Brett Kavanaugh came from kind of a lesser Chevy Chase. He came from Chevy Chase Section 5. There's also a town of Chevy Chase, or Chevy Chase, D.C. But if you really study the data, the single wealthiest municipality in the whole D.C. area, which by some measures is the wealthiest region in the country, single wealthiest municipality is the village of Chevy Chase. Like the village of Oostburg, it has a population of 2,000. While the average home in Oostburg costs $150,000, the average home in Chevy Chase costs $1.5 million, and the mean household income is $420,000. Donald Trump, who got 54% in the Republican primary in Maryland statewide, got only 16% in the village of Chevy Chase. The elites rejected Trump. And it wasn't just sort of the swamp elites, as people would say about the D.C. area folk. In addition to losing Western Michigan, Trump lost Grosse Pointe and Ann Arbor, highly educated, high-income places in Michigan. Just as he didn't get 20% in Sioux and Marion County, in Iowa, he also didn't get 20% in Johnson and Story County, Iowa, which are 2 of the most educated counties in America. And south of Oostburg, Trump's worst counties in Wisconsin were the educated, suburban, wealthy Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington County. So something's going on in these elite places. And here I always like to address something in the book I call the Lena Dunham fallacy. Now, this is already a bit of an outdated reference, but Lena Dunham is the author of the show Girls, and it was sort of a famous sort of icon, I would say, of sort of millennials trying to reject sort of traditional values, etc. And she's an icon in part because she's helped foster false belief among a lot of conservatives that liberal elites all graduate from Wesleyan, become decadent people who eschew marriage and hate children, and then just go off and live these selfish lives. This is not at all what our country's elites, liberal or otherwise, do. Conservatives sometimes see how marriage is retreating and church attendance is going down and say, oh, it's all those people with the college degrees and the wealthy. That's not at all what's happening. If the liberal guy in Sioux County could tell me that out there they vote right and live left, I can say that in places like Chevy Chase and Grosse Pointe, et cetera, they may vote left, but they live right. Which is to say, about 95% of Chevy Chase's families had 2 parents at home. The village hall hosts father-daughter dances with Scottish pipers. People finish school, get married, have kids, stay married, get involved in their kids' lives, and then stay involved serving the community. The data on the elites nationwide tell this story. While 50% of babies born to the working class women are born out of wedlock, it's only 10% among college-educated women. If you are a parent in the upper third of income, your children are half as likely to have a child out of wedlock as the children of parents in the lower third. College-educated men are much more likely to get married, and college-educated men are half as likely to get divorced. So as I tell the conservatives who sometimes fall into the Lena Dunham fallacy, the liberal elites are practicing what we conservative Catholics are preaching. So now we see two different types of places that are rejecting Trump. Orange City, Holland, Salt Lake City, Kent Mill, or Chevy Chase, Ann Arbor, Wauwatosa on the other hand. The conservative religious places and the liberal elites. But what I argue is that these are not two types of places. This is one type of place. Specifically, these are the places where the American dream is alive because they have many overlapping institutions of civil society, whether they be the First Christian Reformed Church or the Chevy Chase Public Schools and Little League and Country Club. They are the places where communities are strong because they are planted thick with institutions that connect people to one another. As a wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child. Both the village of Oostburg and the village of Chevy Chase are that village where family formation is possible. Where these institutions are gone is where people believe the American dream is dead. So the affliction of the working class and middle class in middle America is this. Too many places have too few of these institutions of civil society, and too few people belong to these things. The result is that people are left alienated, not connected, lacking a safety net, lacking a sense of purpose, lacking modeling, and thus lacking access to the good life. So that's what I argue in the book, and it's important sometimes speaking to an audience like this to emphasize what community actually does. Because J.D. Vance wrote in Hillbilly Elegy that he was shocked when he showed up at law school and networking was such a part of it. And when he tried to explain it to the other people at Yale Law, they didn't even understand what he was talking about. Because as he put it, networking is the air that they breathe. So if you are in college, if you are involved with a small liberal arts religious college, if you live in a town like this and belong to parishes like this, you may take it for granted that you got here because of the things that you belong to, because your parents signed you up for Little League, because your parents sent you to a great public school that they were involved in, or a great Catholic school or private school that reflected your values and formed this tight-knit institution of civil society. The benefits that we all get if you are raised in one of these tight communities are easy to miss because they're like the air that we breathe. So what does community do? First thing it does is it provides a safety net. So I'm just going to read a little from the beginning of the book about an incident that happened while I was writing the book. My daughter, Eve, was 1 year old, and she had this breathing issue. And it started to get worse. And then on a Sunday morning, my wife and I had to do what we call the divide and conquer, where one of us goes to an early mass and then another goes to a later mass so that the young kid can stay home. In this case, it was a sick kid. So it wasn't just us not wanting to bring a 1-year-old to mass. So I didn't feel guilty about this one. So I went to the early mass with most of the kids, and then I came home and I was holding Eve. My wife was at the 11:30 with our oldest. And I'm holding Eve, and she goes from sort of lethargic to collapsed. And I run over, and I had bought this pulse oximeter thing that measures the oxygen content in their blood, and I put it on her finger, and it's way down below 90%. And this is not good, and I Google it, and yeah, it's not good. And I don't have the car, though, because my wife's at Mass. And so I calling and texting, and she's not answering the phone. She doesn't even know it's ringing. And so I throw Eve in the jogging stroller, and I start sprinting down Georgia Avenue towards the urgent care center. When my wife finally sees the messages and gets and meets us. Eventually, even the hospital emergency room can't get enough oxygen in her lungs. So then we have to go to Children's Hospital, which thankfully we're in the DC area. So there's an amazing Children's Hospital. And they say, okay, she's going to be fine. But it's going to take about a week to get it to the point where she can breathe on her own without this machine. So you're here for a week in the pediatric intensive care unit, which is about a 45-minute drive from our house. And so the book starts with me sort of waking up in this little room because we didn't want to leave her alone, and we were trading off and making sure we were sort of tag teaming over there at the hospital. And as I was trying to describe all the stuff when my son read this, he said, "You should have told him about the lunchroom thing." I said, "What about the lunchroom thing?" He said, "How that week Everybody envied me and Brendan because we had the best lunch for 1 week. And it's because people had brought us corner bakery food and all this stuff. And it was for 1 week that it was good, which is great because I'm the one who makes it the other weeks of the school year. But I swear I make good lunches, but not as good as that. As I thought about each person or couple who helped us or wrote or called, I noticed these weren't simple bilateral relationships. In almost every case, there was an institution that linked us. Again, this wasn't how we thought of our friends generally. They were just our friends. But whenever I described to others the help we got, I found myself speaking of the couple from our parish or the family from our pool. Some help came from parents at the same boys' school where our sons go. Others were my college classmates. Others were work colleagues at the Examiner or American Enterprise Institute. Parents of the kids I had coached in baseball helped. The woman who sent the corner bakery feast is in my wife's book club and attends the same Virginia parish as my wife's parents. The Grubhub gift card came from an organization on whose board I had sat. Our dense and broad network of friends, which had become a short-term safety net, wasn't merely a network of friends. It was a network of organizations, companies, churches, schools, and clubs. The hubs that bound us to these friends are what we call institutions of civil society. So that's the main thing that one of the main things that civil society does. But it's not just what it provides below, it's also above. They provide a sense of purpose. So one thing that one of the books that I relied on in this is called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And Coming Apart was criticized in some part because he talked about the working class lacking some virtues. And one of the sort of vices that he described was idleness. And what I argue is that idleness is not necessarily thought of as a vice, but you might think of it as an affliction. That the reason I'm not idle is not because I'm this great guy who runs out and finds things to do. It's because I'm not great at escaping after Mass when somebody has that look in their eyes and they're coming up to me about to ask me to do something. And at the swim club, you're at the pool and people, the more things you belong to, the more you get roped into doing stuff. So I had a thing. Again, it was after Mass and a guy came up to me and said, "Oh, Tim, I see Meg is signed up for basketball." And I said, my wife did that. And then she says, "Well, you know what? There's a lot of girls from this parish signed up for basketball and we don't have a coach." I said, "Oh, well, good luck." And he said, "No, will you be the coach?" Okay, Meg is in kindergarten. Kindergarten basketball should not exist, all right? And so I just say, you know what? Look, I would do it. I would do it. This year I'm really busy. Why? What are you doing? I'm writing a book. What's the book about? It's about the importance of strong community. Yeah. So you are looking at a kindergarten girls basketball coach. It's a very successful season, let me tell you. I have a sense of purpose because there are people who need me, and there are more people who need me, not just the 6 people who need me in my house. And by the way, yes, my wife is home with 6 children. Her name is Katie. Please pray for her this whole weekend. Not just the 6 people who need us, but people in our parish, people in our swim club, people, our neighbors who rely on us because we belong to things. There's also research that I talk about in the book about how upward mobility is very highly correlated with civil society. The more that in a community, the more people who belong to more things, the more volunteering there is, the more likely a child in the lowest economic quintile is to rise up to the higher ones. That's by Raj Chetty, a researcher out there. So these little platoons that catch you when you fall, that give you a sense of purpose, that provide sort of access to that mobility of the American dream, they are the beating heart of the American dream. So where they're dead is where we get the struggles. So where is it dead? So quick aside, part of what I do gets called bar reporting, which is I go to a bar and I sit there until the people talk to me about politics. And over the years, I realized that some bars were better than others. You don't go to college bars because most of the people are from out of state and college kids don't really vote. Sorry, they don't. You don't go to a hotel bar because they're tourists from out of town. The sweet spot I found was yuppie Irish pubs because you had Republicans and Democrats, men and women, old and young. You had racial diversity, da-da-da. Another place that I would skip, though, was I call them roadside country bars because you would drive into these places. These are places that are not in downtown anything. They don't have like a cutout to go to a parking lot. It's just like the street and then gravel, and then there's no windows at all on the front of the church. I mean, the church. On the front of the bar. And so so you'd walk in there and you try to talk to them about politics, and they say, politics is a bunch of BS, I don't vote. Well, guess what? 2016 election, you walk into those very same bars and people say, politics is a bunch of BS, that's why I'm supporting Donald Trump. So I was in one such place called Smitty's in Uniontown in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. I picked Fayette County because I'd found a student who had done a study on the drop-off of religious affiliation in the different counties in Pennsylvania. And among evangelicals and Catholics, Fayette County had one of the greatest drop-offs. So I show up at Smitty's, and while I was there, I was able to do some research, and I found it's also in the top 2 on disability, top 2 on unemployment, all these other negative indicators. But again, I had landed there by looking for where were people dropping out of religion. Politics is what you expect. So Uniontown's diverse, but the bar, everybody was white. Everybody was voting for Trump. If you ask them about policies, they'd say because of guns, but people don't really vote based on policies. It's an expression of, it's a cultural expression often is what it is. And so what were they trying to express? I asked them about the economy, and they'd say these 2 conflicting things. There are no jobs, and nobody will do the jobs. And when they start talking about lazy people, you hear the same third-hand stories you hear anywhere, which is, oh, this woman, my neighbor saw a woman with trying to buy dog food with food stamps, and when they wouldn't let her, she grabbed a T-bone steak and said, Fido's eating well tonight. And again, the stories are the same in Fayette County, PA, as they are in Council Bluffs, Iowa, et cetera. And they're always third hand. And a lot of times there's a racial undertone to them. And there's stories about people on disability who can really work, and they're selling drugs, et cetera. And I'm listening to all these stories on 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in a bar from these men, and most of whom are not retirement age. And so yes, I was in the bar, but that was literally my job, again, to be there. But so I turned to this guy, Dave. Dave, why don't you work? And he has this excruciating history of back pain. And I say, so the jobs around here are manual labor, and no desk jobs. He says, no, I can't sit at a desk for half an hour. And I say, Dave, you've been sitting at a bar stool for about 90 minutes. But that's when Dave looks at me and he just says, today I'm numb because my son died this morning. And that's when I realized that the data I had been studying 10 feet down at the bar earlier about the opioid deaths, about all of that, had a real face. That the reality of life outside the connected bubble that I live in and that so much of us live and work in is this dark reality. It's not a story of some men who lost their privilege and are complaining that they have a slightly lower job, or who lost their factory job and now they have to do service jobs. It's a story of true alienation, of record high suicides in the United States right now, of skyrocketing deaths, not just from opioids, but increasingly now from meth. And that the collapse of community isn't just that people don't have a Memorial Day parade to walk in anymore, or don't have basketball teams for their kindergartners to play in. The collapse of community is the collapse of the infrastructure that makes the good life possible. And I'm not talking about record success or making tons more money than your parents, but simply the good life that we would all want, and that Dave clearly wanted for his son, but that Fayette County and Uniontown wasn't providing. And I put this on community, and I think it's well researched in this. Overdoses, suicides are higher among the socially disconnected. Psychiatrist Aaron Cariety explained the rise in white middle-aged suicides this way. We're not living in community anymore. We're living in isolation. We don't have people to provide meaning and give hope. Boston Globe said that those who were more socially isolated were more likely to die during a given period than their socially connected neighbors, even after you correct for age, gender, lifestyle choices. Other things that come from isolation, one is the retreat from marriage. People get married less, so if you look at what's happened with marriage, it has a high correlation with class. It used to not. So if you look at who's married at the age of 40, divided by education, it used to be whether you graduated, whether you went to college or not, and whether you graduated from college, there was no difference. 82% in 1960 were married at age 40. Steady drop across all three, but much more, but not equal. If you graduated from college right now at age 40, there's a 2/3 chance that you're married. If you went to some college but didn't finish, it's about a 60% chance. If you graduated high school but didn't go to college, there's less than a 50% chance that you're married at age 40. So family building, again, it takes a village. People who don't live in strong communities, and the communities are much more eroded among the working class, people who don't live in strong communities are less likely to get married and stay married. And another consequence of the lack of community is radicalism. People have always known. You talk about how street gangs happen. Oh, these boys need something to belong to. Well, I think white nationalism is rising in the U.S. because there's a lot of boys who need something to belong to. So they say, I don't have a religion. I don't really have a hometown. I don't have an ethnicity, but I am white and I am American. So they sign up for something that gives them a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging. And the most important institution of civil society, and the reason it's on the front of my book, is a church. Church produces good outcomes. Now, obviously, I'm a Catholic, and I believe that the sacraments at church give you really good outcomes, like the best outcome, right? But in a totally secular perspective, if you go to church regularly, you are less likely, in married women who go to church and their husbands go to church are less likely to cheat, be cheated on, be abused, or get divorced. Robert Putnam, who's wrote Bowling Alone and is not necessarily terribly warm towards organized religion, had to note, church-going kids have better relationships with their parents and other adults, have more friendships with high-performing peers, more involved in sports, extracurricular activities, etc. And so, how did we get here general? I'll talk about the causes, but first a big picture. Again, the front of this is a shuttered church. It's not a shuttered factory. The closing of the factories near Uniontown is the first domino, and it has to be part of the story. But it's not the whole story. A first domino falls. If there's something else there to stop it from knocking over the other dominoes, a community can stand. So if you go downriver, north a little bit from Uniontown, you end up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is thriving right now in a way that Uniontown isn't. Both were totally dependent on oil and coal. What happened? Why did they go in different directions? I think the story goes like this. In Uniontown, the factory closed. Then the coffee shop where the men went before and after their shifts closed down. Then some of the families said, we got to get out of here. We're going somewhere else where those are jobs. Those were the families who were the most involved in the churches and in the public schools. They pull themselves out. What makes a good public school a good public school? Involved parents. Everybody will tell you that. So now the public school is just a place where you drop off your kids, and it's no longer a hub of civil society. The churches start losing attendance. They end up shuttering down. And then you end up where it is now. What happened in Pittsburgh? The factory shut down. Some of the businessmen said, we're going to set up other institutions. These institutions are both going to hire people, which is very, very important. People need money to buy the stuff they need. But it's also going to provide meeting grounds, learning grounds, education grounds, training grounds for everybody. And then you've got these tight-knit neighborhoods, whether it's this Polish Catholic neighborhood over here, whether it's Squirrel Hill, a famed old Jewish neighborhood over here. And those neighborhoods, just by themselves, not even just these organic institutions, they also provide support for people who are out of jobs trying to raise their kids. Hey, can you watch my kids while I go and do a job interview? Can you help my wife while I have to go out into central PA to get a job working in the fields for a little while? And so then, the way economics works is these guys all lost their jobs. Somebody comes by 20 years later, says, we want to hire people. We're going to Western PA, a lot of out-of-work people there. So then they look at Pittsburgh and they say, yes, we're hiring here, but let's go check out Uniontown. In Uniontown, there's a lot of men who are not taking responsibility for their children. There's a lot of women who say, I don't know how much I can show up because I'm raising this child by myself. There's a lot of drug abuse. There's a lot of people a lot of schools that just didn't inculcate the good habits and good virtues because they weren't strong institutions of civil society. So what I'm arguing here is that it's not just the loss of money that leads to the loss of these institutions. The loss of these institutions then in the long run leads to the loss of money and employment and creates this vicious circle. So finally, before we go to questions, what are the root causes of the retreat from civil society? First, again, church is the most important. The failure of the church, the biggest failure of my book is that I didn't talk more about the failures of the church. The failures of the church has to be up front. My church, the hierarchy of my church covered up sexual assault and rape by priests. That people lost trust in that institution is natural. That people kept trust in that institution, I think, is a miracle and a blessing. But I've met guys at my local pub who said, oh, you have a church on the front of your book. I stopped going to church. And then you get all like proselytizing and try to convince them. And then they tell a story about how I tried to help kids learn how to fix a car, and they wouldn't let me because I didn't go through the background check. And the priest who wouldn't let me a couple years later gets arrested for abuse. I had no ability to persuade that guy to try to even say a word to him. So that's the very first thing that every Catholic has to think about. How did our church fail? There are other failures besides that I think pale in comparison, but that's one. But outside of our church, society is pushing, modern technology, modern society is pushing people away from belonging to things. There's a notion Tocqueville puts forward. My colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, sums it up nicely. Collectivism and atomism are not opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they are two sides of one coin. That is, these are the two main forces. Collectivism, I call over-centralization, or atomism, hyper-individualism, are two trends of our current society that sound opposite, but really are two sides of the same coin. So how does over-centralization hurt? One, crowding out. Big government, welfare programs in the New Deal and the Great Society have had an effect, and I point to the studies in this book, of crowding out stuff like nonprofit, church, volunteering. All of that stuff happens less the more that government money goes in. And then on the flip side, if you look at welfare reform a couple decades ago, decreases in government expenditures then led to significant increases in church activity. But it's not just over-centralization of government, it's also over-centralization of business. When 5 towns might have 5 general stores, and then they get replaced by one Walmart in between the 5 towns, and everybody has to drive there, and a lot of the people who you see there are not your neighbors, and you don't know, you're going to know your neighbors a little bit less. Economic over-centralization is one of the things that undermines community, but also the over-centralization of our attention. Right now, more people know who the former ambassador to Ukraine is, Marie Yovanovitch, than know who their county supervisor is or their local mayor. Our attention is being drawn away from the local. The other side of it is hyper-individualism. Technology has allowed us to all fully enter into our own little world and ignore everybody around them. And if you see a crowd of 8th graders hanging out nowadays, it can be sort of depressing that they're physically in the same place, but they're not in the same place. And I argue, and we can talk about it when we'll take some questions, that virtual community is better than no community, but it's far worse than real-life community, and often it undermines real-life community. Also, the most important item of hyper-individualism to undermine community, I argue, is the sexual revolution. The idea that marriage is a contractual or transactional relationship, that it's between 2 people rather than between 2 people and a community. That sex, love, and marriage and family formation all belong together. That's now old-fashioned. Undermining family undermines community, which in turn undermines family. So solutions. I'll admit solutions is my weak point. I'm a journalist. I like to point out problems. I'm a youngest child. That's probably also part of that. My first book went like problem index, and that got a lot of complaints. So my second book, I had to put in a solutions chapter. I read it the other day, and it was really bad. It was like, gold standard will solve our problems. I don't agree with any of them. But I take a stab at it. The first one is stop chasing religion out of the public square. And so I'll probably just focus on that one because that's relevant to what Benedictine College is trying to do. Religious institutions can't simply be religious institutions, and educational institutions can't simply be educational institutions. The motto you were saying, scholarship, community, faith, these things are inseparable. You can't educate your children fully. You can't be educated fully without an idea of what the good is. And you can't be a practicing Christian and just have that be what you're doing on Sundays. Nancy Pelosi, when she was trying to defend the contraception mandate, said, well, first of all, when the Obama administration defended the contraception mandate in court, they said, the people who own Hobby Lobby lose their freedom to worship when they enter into commerce. They get to worship how they want, but once they become a store, they lose it. First of all, he used the term freedom of worship. That's not in the Constitution. It's free exercise of religion, right? And you can't exercise your religion, you can't not exercise your religion once you enter into commerce. Nancy Pelosi was defending this, and she said, she got tired of the question. She said, look, I do my religion on Sundays. And then she added, and when she goes to Mass during the week, and that's great. She probably goes to daily Mass more than I do, and I aspire to be more like her in that regard. But I will say this. You cannot do your religion on Sundays. If you are a Christian, and it's not freedom of worship, free exercise of religion. To exercise your religion, you have to do it constantly at all times. It has to be part of your study. It has to be even if it's just there as the telos, the end of what you're studying for. And you have to live as a Christian. You have to live in some sort of community. Now, you could live in a really interesting community like Benedictine friars, or you can live out in your daily community. And that doesn't mean going up to everybody and pounding the Bible at them. You know what it means. It means being a good example. But I would argue that what it really means is loving your neighbor. And what your neighbor needs is connection, is community, is a sense of purpose, and the human level safety net that strong communities can provide. And so around this area, around Kansas City, there's lots of things named Kaufman something or another, gardens, parks, baseball stadiums, etc. Because some people who had a lot of money said, what we're going to do is build institutions that bring people together. And if any of you become that wealthy, do that, okay? That's like my solution. You can't have a big government solution, because that would be, if you had the Federal Department of Community Cohesion, it wouldn't work, okay? But not everybody here is going to be wealthy enough to spend that much money. So to come back home, I talked about Arcola Avenue and Kemp Mill, where the synagogues are. Those two streets intersect, and at that intersection is St. Andrew Apostle Catholic Church, my parish. If you go out behind the baseball diamond in my parish, there's a little sign. And when I teach the t-ball players to throw, they're throwing the ball at this one sign. And after doing this for a couple weeks, I was like, I should probably read what this sign is. And it says, Dottoli's Diamond. Mike Dottoli did not donate millions of dollars to St. Andrew Apostle. You could tell if you look at the field, it doesn't have millions of dollars poured into it. So I read the plaque and I read up on him, a little bit of history. He was a guy who was a dad and coached t-ball and baseball in our parish. He died kind of young in his 50s, but everybody recognized how much time he gave to his community, and that is why he got a plaque there. So, if you have the wealth, build gardens and libraries, do what they did in Pittsburgh, do what the Kaufmans did here. Not everybody here will. But because there's no one big solution, there's 100,000 little solutions, right? It's going to be on a very local level. And that's what's going to turn America around. And I hope, in a room like this, that there are 100 of those little solutions, that the people here can be the Mike DeTolis, can be the people who build communities, who make every place they live a great place to raise kids, a great place to learn, a great place to study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was really great. Tim's going to take about 5, maybe 10 minutes of questions, we'll see. Okay, so I'll have the timer going.
Sorry, I got a little carried away there. I went on. Yes, in the back. Oh, you got a microphone coming to you. That way everyone can hear.
Yeah, thank you very much for your words. I think they were very helpful. I like the idea of intermediate communities and so on. I teach Catholic social thought here, and that's a key part of Catholic social thinking is intermediate community and the importance of their worth.
Yep.
So on. One of when I read you were coming, I thought of a book I had read in the 60s when I was an undergraduate, and it was by Robert Nisbet, A Quest for Community.
Yep.
And so I went back and read about 40 or 50 pages, 60 pages of that book yesterday and today. And one of the key connections that he makes is between intermediate communities and freedom, and true freedom. And one of the points that he makes is that without the strength of intermediate communities, democracies can devolve into totalitarianism.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you would talk about that connection.
So that's exactly right, and there's a lot to go on, and I mean, I can't speak as well as Nisbet, and I probably should have memorized him, but man is a political animal. We're going to find our meaning not just in minding our own business, and I would say Christians are going to come to know God not just through contemplating him, and not even through just contemplating him and reading the Bible, but through interacting with other people. This is how we come to know God, is by loving one another. And this is where we get our meaning, is from this interactions. If we lose these interactions, if we lose the ability to exercise our political muscle and find our meaning on a very human, local level, we turn to something else to find our meaning. I think that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are explained in part by people thinking that national politics should help them find their meaning. These are both a lot more benign than totalitarianism, but you see the centralizing impulse there, and you see how if people are looking to a central state to find their meaning, people should be able to shape the world around them. I said to some of the students earlier, I do it through mostly my parish. If you look from a satellite at St. Andrews, it looks different today than it did 4 years ago, because I got them to turn the baseball field back to a baseball field. So it looks different from space. And that's how I shape my community. Not by getting some law passed or anything like that, but if you don't have access to something like that, you look to shape the world around you in ways that more represent controlling the lives of other people. So that's one very specific way in which I think that the loss of intermediate institutions can lead to a sort of totalitarianism. There's plenty of other ways to answer that. Yes?
My question very much flows from your answer. So you said that some of the causes from the retreat from civil society were the decrease in people who go to church, and then also the increase in collectivism with like welfare and things. So would you say that there was kind of a replacement of people who would normally go to church and be devoted to that, and then now it's kind of the government is our church, and the thing like that close-knit that you said that we fall back on?
Yeah, I think it happens in a couple ways. And there's one researcher I know who's working on connecting these dots that I connect through sort of multiple studies, doing one study and trying to see if localized increases in government welfare spending leads not just to a decrease in church and nonprofit spending, but actually in church attendance, which is what I believe happens. Why does that happen? Because one reason people do belong to things is it's an opportunity to serve other people. And I mean, that's sort of a nice thing to think about, right? Like that we are naturally, I think especially Americans, we want to serve other people. And I know some people have literally will wake up and go out and buy a bunch of groceries and make sandwiches and hand them out to homeless people, right? But 99% of the world doesn't do that. People who do go out and feed the poor, almost all of them are plugging into an institution that enables them to do it. And so for a lot of people, church is a way to serve other people. If church stops being a way to serve other people because the government takes away, starts doing what it does, then that's one reason people stop going to church. Another way to think about it, though, is that politics is increasingly becoming a religion. That, and on both sides, absolutely today. And that when people worry about kind of some of the speech codes that are being issued and the cancel culture and a lot of that, it's because someone reacts to sort of, if you refuse to cater a gay wedding by making a special cake for it, it's not just that you're oppressing one person, it's that you're violating a moral teaching that much of our culture has come to see. And so and the reason that it's a moral teaching is because the Supreme Court declared it to be. The Supreme Court handed down a tablet and said that this happens, and so everybody has to follow that rule. And so I do think that politics replacing religion, and again, I do think it's also happening on the Republican side as well, where politics is replacing religion. So, yes, sir.
Just a question. On the issue of public assistance and welfare, the data I think is much more mixed. Of all of the ethnic groups in the United States, blacks are overwhelmingly, we pray more, we read the Bible. I mean, the data is just obvious. Now, in certain depressed areas, the blacks have the same, and the data is clear, Pew's done all the research on that, and there's no correlation between their receiving public assistance and the decline of religion for blacks.
Yep.
There's just no data for that, right? And so I just, I don't want to make too broad a generalization. I get the not relying on public assistance and the dependency issue, but we should be a little more careful in terms of the use of the data because the generalization over groups when there's significant variability, right?
Yes.
Blacks believe in God.
Well,
right?
but rural blacks have seen a large drop-off in church attendance in a way that suburban and urban blacks have not. If you go down to Mississippi, and whether that
there
has
a few months ago.
Whether that has to do with, and you would know the causes better than I do. So I agree, and that one of the really interesting things here is that the things. I think black churches and white churches in America and Hispanic churches behave very differently. Right. So what I'm talking about here, if it's happening on a macro level, you're exactly right. I shouldn't posit that it's happening on every lower level. Very specific, quick point here. Right. When white men lose jobs, they're likely to stop going to church.
Right.
When black men lose jobs, the data shows that they're actually more likely to go to church. Right. And if you think about that first reaction, it's exactly backwards. If our churches are places where people show up when they have their stuff together, that's the opposite. Right. Jesus wasn't looking for the people who had their stuff together. Right. Right. And so this is a white church problem. I don't think it exists in the immigrant church, but it certainly is in the black church. Is more of a I'm showing up here because I know that I need something more, both community and God. One more question?
Yeah.
Where's...
So I just want to support what you've been saying by, how many people in the room know what a casserole is? So my father passed away when
You said a casserole. I thought out here they said casserole without the Sorry.
This is a story that you'll use later, believe me. So my father passed away when I was 6. 8 brothers and sisters. We had 30 casseroles delivered to our house the day he passed away. Every year when something would happen, Mom would make a casserole for someone else. About 3 years ago, some people from New York moved into our neighborhood. We heard that one of their parents died. My wife called up and said, "Can I bring over a casserole?" And they literally said, "What's a casserole?" So I would ask you, does Trump have the, I don't know what a casserole vote, and how does he capture the casserole vote?
That is good, but I do think it's a little bigoted against us New Yorkers. We have lasagna, we have all sorts of things, okay? So in the general election, Trump gets the most of the casserole vote, although at a lesser rate than Romney. I mean, is there more casserole candidate in American history than Mitt Romney? I don't know. But to the degree that your question was about political prediction, I'm going to point you to an article I wrote in 2016, headline, "No, Donald Trump Can't Win," and then maybe you won't ask me for any more political predictions. Anyway, guys, thank you very much.